Okay, this Tactica is going to cover the Repentia. They're a elite choice for the Sisters of Battle Codex. And in 6th edition, you've got to be really careful with elite choices. They can never be scoring, so they're potentially points lost in a lot of missions. So I think this is the only elite choice in the Sisters Codex that anyone is reasonably going to take. And even then, they have a lot of drawbacks, and so you've got to be kind of careful with them. So just to start with, if you spend 90 points, you would get 4 Repentia and a superior, which is called the Mistress of Repentance. And how does this squad work? They on paper are pretty good. They actually look really good as a unit on paper, and they have some drawbacks. There's some things that make them not quite as good as they appear, but basically they're infantry that are not allowed to take their own vehicle. Now they can ride in a vehicle, which is a change from the previous codex, but they don't get theirs to start with, so they're infantry that have to walk at the beginning. Each one of them is essentially a naked girl with a large chainsaw. They have no armor with the exception of the Mistress. So these girls have their 6-up Shield of Faith, and then they have Feel No Pain. So they, in terms of their armor, they actually have about a 50% chance of making their save against anything that is strength 6 or less. And then the Mistress here, she has power armor, so she has her 3-up power armor save and her Shield of Faith, but she doesn't have Feel No Pain. So just running through the unit, what they have that rules I just described. They're fearless, so as long as one girl is alive, the unit is fearless. The Mistress is not. The unit has fleet. They have rage, which has greatly improved in 6th edition, so these girls no longer have to chase grots around or whatever the nearest enemy unit is. It gives them an extra attack when they charge, so it gives them 4 attacks on a charge, which is pretty impressive, assuming they live. And they have an active faith, which is Spirit of the Martyr. It means that during combat, at the beginning of the assault phase, you roll for your active faith. If it goes off when a girl dies, you just lay her down, and when it gets to initiative 1, she swings, and then you remove her. This active faith, however, has a little bit of a drawback. Acts of faith benefit when one member or more of a unit dies. You get a +1 to your active faith. Because you roll for the active faith at the start of the assault phase, you don't actually benefit from this rule until at least 2 rounds into combat. So, runs through their rules. They have no upgrades. The only person in the entire squad that can take anything is the Mistress. She can take a melt-a-bomb. And you probably want to, because she's otherwise going to be strength 3 against vehicles and fortifications and such. So the melt-a-bombs at 5 points is a pretty good choice, and this unit is going to go after monstrous creatures and vehicles and such. So I mentioned earlier they can ride in a transport, but they don't get their own, so what you probably want to do with a squad like this is pick up a Rhino or an Immolator, but the Rhino is maybe better, and park it in front of them at the beginning of the game and let them jump in on round 1 and then drive it downrange. That is, however, the weakness to the Repentia, is that to get them down into your opponent's deployment zone, you pretty much have to sacrifice a couple rounds of the game. I've never actually had really good experience with them. They look great on paper. They're a solid unit against monstrous creatures, and they act as a deterrent in your own deployment zone, but they just have a hard time making it to your opponent. But we'll talk about their rules, give a little of their basics. As a squad, they're one of the few combat squads for the Sisters. Each one of them is armed with an Eviscerator, which is a 2-handed monstrous chainsword with armor bane. What does it do? It boosts their strength to 6, basically, and gives them armor bane. So each one of these girls is not quite as good as having a melt-a-bomb, but they get multiple attacks. So they have two attacks base. They probably get 2 attacks on the first round if they can charge. Unfortunately for them, those attacks go on initiative 1 because eviscerators are unwieldy and thus go on initiative 1. So these girls usually strike last in combat, which can be a disadvantage. I think that's why they gave them the Act of Faith that lets them swing, after they die, but it still doesn't help the squad. So when you're thinking about tactics with the Repentia, you have to be kind of careful with the assault. I mean, they are a close combat unit, but you don't want to take a squad of Repentia up against, say, a mob of orcs or a large number of Eldar or something, because what's going to happen is they're going to get wiped out before they actually get to do anything. And sure, their Act of Faith lets them swing once after they're dead, but they're still dead. So you could lose your Repentia pretty quickly against a big squad of combat guys, but that's where you got to be careful. This is the unit you want to take up against monstrous creatures, probably, because they're going to possibly swing at the same time, and walkers, and vehicles, and fortifications like the Bastion. Some Repentia would just take the Bastion apart for the most part, so that's where you want to use them. So this is a unit you've got to be careful with in terms of what you assault. So one of the things to think about with the squad is, how do I get enough eviscerators downrange with the girls? And I would suggest take the additional sisters. You probably don't want to take you can only take 5 more, so you could take 10, including the mistress, and get them in a rhino. If you're going to take an immolator, remember you can't have more than 6 individuals. So the squad here would be too big. You'd have to have your 5 girls and your mistress for an immolator, which is why I think the rhino's better. Talking about other weapons, they basically can't shoot, with one exception. The mistress has frag and crack grenades, so she can throw those up to 8 inches, meaning that she can throw the crack grenade as Overwatch when they get assaulted. She can't throw the frag. It's okay. It allows her to get one shooting attack off against a squad you're going to attack, or a monstrous creature, and that's probably worth it, because if you're going to kill it with one hit, and you probably don't want to waste the girls with the eviscerators on it, but you might take 1 wound off something. She has really weird weapons, the kind that seem on paper to have a huge disadvantage. She's armed with these neural whips. Neural whips are power weapons, so they're unusual power weapons, meaning that they're AP3. They are strength 8. Sounds awesome, until you realize it's strength 8 hitting or wounding against your opponent's leadership, which is often 9 or 10. So these weapons are actually not that likely to wound when they hit, because your opponent's leadership is usually pretty high. But there is an interesting thing to consider, is that they are strength 8, and according to the basic rulebook, the rules for instant death say that if a model suffers an unsaved wound from an attack that has a strength value of double its toughness value or greater, it is reduced to 0 wounds and removed as a casualty. So she has a strength 8 whip that wounds against leadership, but it is still strength 8, and nowhere in the instant death rule does it say anything about other characteristics. So her whips should cause instant death to anything with toughness 4 or lower. The eviscerators are going to cause instant death to anything with toughness 3, but there aren't many multiple wound characters with toughness 3 except for the HQs. So that's probably sort of meaningless, but she could end up in a challenge and thus need those whips. What other things to think about? So, my experience with these girls is that they're very hard to get to your opponent without losing a lot of them. So probably take the largest squad you can afford, and afford is something to think about because they're some of the more expensive models, I think, for what you get. And I don't mean point-wise in the game, I mean cost-wise. Anyways, so Tactica-wise, it's a solid unit, but it's you got to be careful with the elites. Got to really consider whether you want them or whether you want to take a different squad. I think in terms of sisters and close combat, there are only 2 units in the Codex that really do any effective close combat, and it would be the Repentia and the Penitent Engines. They have advantages and disadvantages to both. This unit goes down pretty easy, but you can't one-shot kill it unless you're shooting a blast, versus the Penitent engines, which could be killed on a single hit with a las cannon. So think about it. Okay, so other things to think about with this unit. They're an infantry squad, so independent characters can join them. Do they benefit from the independent characters? Not as much as some of the other sister squads. And now here's why. They don't shoot. So independent characters who have a shooting attack aren't really doing great to be with a bunch of Repentia. So I'm not sure I would put them in the squad. There are some benefits, though. The Confessor, the Arch-Confessor, or Uriah would give the squad Hatred, meaning that they get a complete reroll of all misses on the first round of combat, and that is pretty awesome for the Repentia. They significantly benefit from having Uriah in the squad because Uriah gives them an extra attack. They don't benefit from his Feel No Pain rule because they already have it, but he gives them an extra attack, and that's pretty good. So then they would have at least a base 3, but they might get up to 5 attacks on the first round and get to reroll, so that's pretty devastating. The Arch-Confessor gives them the Hatred, but not the extra attack, so I would keep him out of the squad for the most part. And then St. Celestine, I don't see a whole lot of use for her in the squad. She has a flamer and a poisoned sword, so she is pretty good at close combat. But she probably doesn't want to be tied down to this squad. She could act as a armor 2 tank running in front of them, but that's probably a waste of her points. Other than that, if you take Imperial Guard Blood Brothers, you could put a Primaris Psyker with them, and he does have close range psychic powers, and Biomancy would possibly really boost the squad. On top of that, if you added a Commissar, you wouldn't get a whole lot of anything because he's not built to run into combat with a bunch of Eviscerators, so I would keep him out. Summary on the squad. Repentia look pretty nice on paper. They have solid stat lines. They have a weapon and ballistic skill of 4. They're going to be strength 6 for all intents and purposes. They're toughness 3, so they're basic sisters. They have 1 wound each. They're getting at least 2 attacks, and they're fearless, so their leadership doesn't really matter for much. They have the disadvantage of being somewhat slow, so difficult to get to your opponent before they get shot down, because anyone who sees them charging them will potentially just shoot them down because no one wants to get hit by an Eviscerator. I've actually taken out Apocalypse Scale walkers with one of these, so it's a powerful unit. You don't want to let it hit you, so people shoot it down pretty quickly. Closing on the unit, what would I say? I would say this is definitely not a leave it at home unit, but it's one which you have to seriously consider. What am I going to do with these girls, and do I have a solid fit for them in the army? Are they going to get their points back, or are they going to deter my opponent from doing something, or are they just a waste of 90 to 100 and some points? And that's up to you and what your army list looks like and what it looks like where you're playing. But they're not an automatic choice, and they're not an automatic leave at home.